free will as an American divine of the 18th century, Jonathan Edwards, did. He said, we believe in free will because we know about our behavior, but not about its causes. And of course, it's the object of a science of behavior to discover causes. And once you have found those causes, there is less you need to attribute to an internal act or will, and eventually, I think, you need to attribute nothing to it.
At the end of the decade, things get weird. 1939 introduced the Wechsler-Bellevue intelligence test. The IQ test was used to measure the cognitive abilities and intelligence of people in later stages of adulthood. The test is still used today and was evolved from that time, but its origins remain in the 30s. However, the end of the decade was more of a setup for the future dilemmas, as World War II kicked off at the tail end of the 30s on September 1st, 1939.
Hi, I am Abby Vandenberg, and I will be presenting the history of psychology in the 1950s. The 1950s was the age of consumerism, as the ending of the Second World War 5 years previous brought along a booming economy, and the higher incomes and aggressive marketing mixed to create a huge demand for goods. The 1950s was also a time centered around the nuclear family, the ideal family with a working husband, homemaking wife, and happy children. It was also the beginning of the Korean War. For the world of psychology, there were also some very important discoveries made during this decade. In 1950, Erik Erikson, a German-American developmental and psychoanalysis psychologist, published his book that outlines his theory on the stages of psychosocial development and coined the term for identity crisis. As a Jewish child with blonde hair and blue eyes living in Germany, Erik Erikson was bullied on all sides and ridiculed his entire childhood, leading to a great identity crisis, which he eventually combated by dropping his last name Hamburger before he moved to America.
Hamburger.
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 Ham.
Ham.
Bur.
Bur.
Gur.
Gur.
After working with Sigmund Freud's daughter Anna Freud and observing and working with children for years through psychoanalysis, he came to his theories on psychosocial development and eventually created what we know as Erik Erikson's 8 stages of psychosocial development. In 1952, the very first Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, was first published by the American Psychiatric Association. In 1953, the Code of Ethics for Psychologists was developed by the American Psychological Association in response to the rise in need for psychologists since the end of World War II, as well as the publicity that they were receiving because of that need. A committee was made and they looked over submitted papers from psychologists who felt they had reached some ethical roadblocks in their work, and from that the Code of Ethics was born. In 1954, an American psychologist by the name of Abraham Maslow published his book, Motivation and Personality, introducing the Maslow hierarchy of needs. Abraham Maslow was a born and raised New Yorker. His parents were poor but valued education, and he attended one of the best all-boys schools in Brooklyn, where he spent most of his time reading in the library. Nerd. When Maslow attended Columbia University later in life, he found a mentor in Alfred Adler, who had worked with famous psychologists such as Sigmund Freud himself. Not really the flex he thought it was.
It's all just a real load of crap.
And then as I worked on this abnormal psychology book and decided to have a chapter on the normal personality, because I figured psychotherapy ought to be for something, and my question was, where is it going? What's it all about? What's it for? And found to my amazement that there was no literature on normality or health, nothing. This kept on growing then.
It was then that Maslow created his Maslow hierarchy of needs, outlining what he believed to be the most basic and most important human needs that motivate and define our behavior. In 1954, Maslow published his book, Motivation and Personality, outlining his hierarchy of needs. In 1958, another American psychologist, John Cohen, wrote and published the first book on humanistic psychology.
Humanism, as founded by Carl Roger, and also the major figure in humanistic psychology is Abraham Maslow, which is famous for the hierarchy of needs, which is universally very publicly accepted and appealing to public. The idea is that the human, it views human from a holistic, dynamic perspective. It's, for example, if we compare that with the view that psychoanalytic perspectives has about the human psyche or human humans. The difference is that it emphasizes on the whole and the dynamism in human as an organism. But the point is that, for example, in psychoanalytic perspective, as concerned with Freudian view, it focuses on sexuality and aggression as two basic drives. But in humanistic psychology, as opposed to psychodynamic perspectives, we use human as a from a holistic perspective, consisting of different levels of needs. For example, when it comes to the Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there is a hierarchy of needs, including biological or shelter, or in other terms, deficiency needs, and then it goes to higher order needs, including aesthetic, cognitive, and ultimately self-actualization needs, or the state of being self-actualized or self-actualizing state. Meaning that it's not that only two or human psyche or motivation or needs could not be reduced to a certain or a limited number of needs, motivations, drives, but it's a holistic dynamic consisting of all elements, all factors, comprehensive and dynamic and holistic.
In 1959, an Austrian psychiatrist, Viktor Frankl, publishes his book, Man's Search for Meaning, about his time in the Holocaust with an existential view. Viktor Frankl was a well-established and educated man in Austria before the Nazis took over in 1938. 9 months after getting married, in 1942, Franklin and his family were taken to a concentration camp, and later transferred to Auschwitz, where his mother and brother died in the gas chambers, and his wife died of typhus in another camp. Frankl spent 3 years in 4 different concentration camps before the end of the World War and the liberation of the concentration camps. After liberation, Frankl went on to study many theories and areas in psychology and eventually founded logotherapy.
And he asked me, what should I do? And they didn't give him any advice. I didn't tell him anything, but I just asked him a question. I asked this old doctor, tell me, doctor, what would have happened if you had died first and your wife would have had to survive?
Had to survive, right.
Thereupon he said, oh, how this would have been terrible, how she had suffered. Thereupon I retorted, well, this suffering, doctor, your wife has been spared this suffering, and it was you who could spare her this suffering. But now, as it were, you have to pay for it. You are billed for it. By the fact that now you have to mourn, you have to suffer, you have to survive her. This man looked me up, and then he stood up, gave me his hand, and silently left my office. He found consolation in this reversal of attitude toward a fate which could no longer be changed. I could not revive his wife, you understand?
Right.
But I could change his attitude. Suddenly he saw a meaning, the meaning of a sacrifice. At the same moment, there was no depression any longer. He could overcome this depression. It remained still suffering, but it was suffering for the sake of someone.
Logotherapy is based on the concept that the ultimate force that motivates our thoughts and actions is finding meaning in life. Again in 1959, another important publication was made by Lawrence Kohlberg, an American psychologist. In his doctoral dissertation, he outlined Kohlberg's stages of moral development. Kohlberg's stages of moral development included 6 stages that could be divided into 3 levels of moral development.
At the pre-conventional level, Finn is driven by fear and Mary by self-interest. Both judge what is right or wrong by the direct consequences they expect for themselves and not by social norms. This form of reasoning is common among children. At the conventional level, Betty responds to peer pressure, and the teacher follows the rules. Their morality is centered around what society regards as right. At this level, the fairness of rules is seldom questioned. It is common to think like this during adolescence and adulthood. At the post-conventional level, Jesse knows that things are complicated because individuals may disobey rules inconsistent with their own morality. The headmaster follows a universal ethical idea, at complete disconnect with what society thinks or the rules say. To him, everything is solved through compassion. The right behavior, in his opinion, is therefore never a means to an end, but always an end in itself. Not every person reaches this level.
Kohlberg did an experiment that tested children by asking them questions about various moral dilemmas, after which he concluded that it was the reasoning behind the decisions that determined moral development more than the actual answers.
Hi, my name is Kashtin Crouch, and I'll be covering the history of psychology in the 1960s. Starting off in 1960, Stanley Milgram earned his PhD in social psychology from Harvard University.
And in the fall of that same year, joined the faculty at Yale University as an assistant professor. During the 1960-1961 academic year, Milgram had been collecting data for a study on obedience, for which he received a 2-year grant from the National Science Foundation. 1961 was a busy year for psychology. First off, Milgram began his experiments on obedience, which lasted until 1963. Milgram's experiments on obedience were inspired partly by Adolf Eichmann, who was the Gestapo chief of Jewish affairs. Eichmann was responsible for the mass deportation of Jewish citizens to ghettos and extermination camps during World War II. After he was apprehended in Argentina, he was placed on trial in 1961, where he claimed that he only did these things because he was following orders. This is what piqued Milgram's interest in blind obedience to authority.
So one of my favorite parts of the history of psychology is the Stanley Milgram experiment. And in that experiment, well, first of all, it's interesting because Milgram was inspired by what happened in World War II and the Nazi Holocaust. And he wanted to see whether or not the excuse that a lot of the perpetrators of the Holocaust were giving was in any way valid. And of course that excuse was that they were just following orders. And so Milgram set up an experiment to see how far regular everyday people would go in the perpetration of harm on an innocent person. And so he set it up like an experiment looking at the effect of punishment on learning, when in fact it was really a study of obedience. And what he found was that most people, about 65% of people, were willing to, at least in their minds, as far as they knew, they were causing great harm to a stranger, a complete innocent stranger, just because the experimenter told them that they needed to continue, and most of them did. And so it was really surprising to most people that this idea that obedience could have such a powerful effect. It was really an eye-opener. The other reason that I really like this period of history is that it was a very controversial study. There were a lot of ethical questions about what Milgram did, and so it ended up helping to transform research ethics in a way that I think is very beneficial for participants, to help protect them from deception and from being put in a position where they would experience that much emotional distress. So a lot of reasons that the Milgram experiment is one of my favorites.
In these experiments, there was a teacher and a learner, and the setup of the experiment was rigged so that all the participants would be teachers.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Learn. Teacher.
The learner was an actor working with Milgram, and none of the participants knew this. The teachers were all told to administer electric shocks to the learner when he answered questions incorrectly. The shock levels were labeled from 15 to 450 volts, along with the labels slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, danger, severe shock, and finally, XXX.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
You
here.
can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man there. I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one. Slow. Walk, dance, truck, music.
2/3 of the participants were willing to progress to the maximum voltage level when pressured to do so by someone they perceived to be an authority figure, which shocked Milgram and the rest of America.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering for less voltage. Can't you check in and see if he's all right, please?
Another event that took place in 1961 was the Carl Rogers published
On Becoming a Person, which marked a powerful change in how treatments of mental health issues were conducted. He believed that if patients felt cared for and valued, then they would confront their problems and make changes that would help them become more of who they really were.
In 1961, Albert Bandura conducts his Bobo doll experiment based off of his social learning theory. These experiments were collectively named the Bobo doll experiment. The experiment consisted of 72 boys and girls between the ages of 3 and 6. These children were then divided into 3 groups. One group was exposed to an aggressive role model, the next group had a non-aggressive role model, and the last group was a control group with no role model. The children in each experimental group are individually brought into a room and given toys to play with, while the role model is simultaneously either acting aggressive towards the doll or acting in a subdued manner towards the doll. The control group is not exposed to any role model. This stage lasts for 10 minutes. Next, the children were individually brought into another room with more relatively attractive toys. As soon as they began to play with these toys, the experimenter told them that the child were not to play with those toys, that they were their best toys, and they needed to be set aside for the other children. This stage of the experiment was used to create mild aggression arousal in each child. Lastly, the children were individually brought into a final room that contained both aggressive toys, such as a mallet, a Bobo doll, as well as other non-aggressive toys, such as a tea set or crayons. The children were left to play and were observed through a one-way glass for 20 minutes. It was concluded that those who were exposed to the aggressive role model in the first stage of this experiment made many more imitated aggressive responses than those in the other 2 groups.
Moving on to 1962, Abraham Maslow published Toward a Psychology of Beings, which compared the terms beings and deficiency in relation to the psychological functions of love, motivation, and cognition. An example of this in his book is the differences between deficiency love and being love, which are also known as D-love and B-love. D-love is more likely to be selfish and include traits like jealousy and possessiveness. D-love is also likely to be more interested in its own gratification than the gratification of another, or to put one's needs above others. On the other hand, B-love is likely to be selfless and undemanding, as well as less possessive and more joyful. B-love also emphasizes taking pride in another's needs, accomplishments, achievements, and overall being. In 1964, Maslow published his book, Religion, Values, and Peak Experiences. In this book, Maslow explained his ideas about a negative relationship between adhering to conventional religious beliefs and being able to have peak experiences.
In 1968, Maslow was elected APA president.
In 1969, self-transcendence was added to Maslow's earlier work on his hierarchy of needs. Evidently, in Maslow's later work, it seemed he had intended for an even higher human need, which was self-transcendence. Self-transcendence is when an individual transcends beyond their own personal concerns and sees from a higher perspective. This allows for deeper understanding and humility, as well as joy and peace.
Hi, I'm Cheyenne.
And I'm Autumn. The 1970s is the era where everyone's attention was on women's rights,
Gay rights,
huge environmental movement,
the Watergate scandal,
Roe v. Wade,
and the end of the Vietnam War. But what was going on in the psychology community during this time?
In the summer of 1971, Stanford professor and American psychologist Dr. Philip Zimbardo conducted one of the most infamous social psychology experiments, the Stanford Prison Experiment. 24 volunteers were separated into 12 guards and 12 prisoners, with the goal to spend 2 weeks in the basement of the Stanford Psychology Department. They wanted to recreate life in a correctional facility, but really they would only last 6 days. This experiment aimed to understand the development of norms and the effects of roles, labels, and societal expectations in a simulated prison environment. However, what the study really found was much more sinister.
It evolves into a confrontation. The guards showing the prisoners who's boss.
The guards quickly adapt to their new profession. Given anonymity by their mirrored sunglasses, some of them start to control the meager food rations, restrict prisoners' bathroom use, and as tensions rise, so do their cruel methods.
Clearly, young men suffered verbally, physically. Prisoners felt shame in their role. Guards felt guilt. So in that sense, it's unethical. That is, nobody has the right, the power, the privilege to do that to other people.
They found that when people feel anonymous and have power over depersonalized others, like in a prison guard situation, they can easily become evil.
Here are the prisoners who are going to be dehumanized. They're going to become numbers. Here are the guards with the symbols of power and anonymity. Guards get prisoners to clean the toilet bowls out their bare hands, to do other humiliating tasks. They strip them naked. They sexually taunt them. They begin to do degrading activities, like having them simulate sodomy. You saw simulating fellatio in Soldiers in Abu Ghraib. My guards did it in 5 days. The stress reaction was so extreme that normal kids we picked because they're healthy had breakdowns within 36 hours. The study ended after 6 days because it was out of control. 5 kids had emotional breakdowns.
This study is key to understanding the Lucifer effect. The Lucifer effect is a tendency for social context to negatively influence and transform human behavior, sometimes to an extreme degree. This study shows that power without oversight is a recipe for abuse. It also serves as a cautionary tale for all military detention operations. The campaign to remove the term homosexuality as a diagnosis from the DSM began in the 1960s. It was backed by civil, women's, and gay rights movements from across the country. Dubbed the Homophile movement, gay and lesbian rights organizations in major cities like New York City, San Francisco, and Philadelphia started to pressure elected officials and launch public campaigns for visibility and rights. Gay liberation efforts were occurring on many fronts, and the APA declassification effort was one part of the movement for equality and acceptance.
Okay, so I think one of the bigger moments in psychology is in 1973 when they voted to remove homosexuality from the DSM. And basically the story of it is that Karen Horney, researcher, basically had profiles done on 30 straight men and 30 gay men, and then she sent them anonymously. She removed any information about their sexuality and sent them to psychiatrists, psychologists, and had them look at these profiles and see if they could determine who was gay. Of course they couldn't. And so that was one of the driving factors in removing homosexuality from the DSM. And there's sort of a not well-known story that happened before this that was kind of also contributed to this moment in time, but there was a psychiatrist. His name was John Fryer, and he went to the American Psychiatric Association annual meeting, and so this was in 1972 when it was still in the DSM, and he wore a disguise, and he got up in front of, like a mask, wig, the whole 9 yards, and he got up in front of the whole conference and said, "I am a homosexual and I am a psychiatrist," and basically just like sent them all into, a frenzy, because he was saying, "I'm a doctor, I'm a professional, and I'm gay, and obviously I'm not mentally ill," right? Was the implication. And so that story is not as well known, but it's sort of an example of how I think individuals can contribute to large-scale movements.
To hide his identity, he wore a Richard Nixon mask and spoke into a microphone that disguised his voice. He spoke as Dr. Anonymous to make a case to remove the term homosexuality from a list of mental disorders.
This is the greatest loss, our honest humanity. And that loss leads all those others around us to lose that little bit of their humanity as well. For if they were truly comfortable with their own homosexuality, then they could be comfortable with ours. As homosexual psychiatrists, therefore, we must use our skills and wisdom to help all of them and ourselves grow to be comfortable with that little piece of humanity called homosexuality.
Due to Dr. Fryer and the efforts of the gay movement, the term egosyntonic homosexuality was removed from the DSM in 1973.
1970, Endel Tolving, who was an Estonian-born Canadian experimental psychologist and cognitive neuroscientist, was the first to propose that endocoding specificity principle in 1973. Human memory can be divided into at least two subtypes: episodic and spasmodic memory.
This is where episodic retrieval occurs, and this is where semantic retrieval occurs.
But what are episodic and spasmodic memory? Episodic memory is the memory for specific events and content.
So, the plan is to erase Chidi's memory all the way back to when the air conditioner fell on his head in his original timeline.
Next time you see me, it'll be like I'm a new resident. I won't know any of you.
So, will you remember that time in Australia when we stayed up late and ate pizza together?
No, buddy, I won't.
Will you remember when we ordered the pizza?
No.
Spasmodic memory is our memory for general knowledge, like world knowledge and vocabulary.
Will you remember pizza?
Will I remember what pizza is? Yeah. I'll still know what pizza is.
Okay, so not a total loss.
Tolving referred to this as a, quote, mental thesaurus, end quote. Distinction became highly influential in memory research, in experimental psychology, and cognitive neuroscience.
Cognitive psychology views emphasize on thought process, cognition's understanding, and it has some outgrowths in recent years or recent decades, such as mindfulness and metacognition and epistemological metacognition. So it's growing, and it's got dominant after humanistic psychology. It could be considered as dominant still today. It's a major very, very potent approach in psychology, and has potential applications in therapy, such as that in CBT or mindfulness-based therapy, and other approaches that could help humans in a way that other approaches cannot. For example, in terms of me filming in this project, in class projects, I've noticed other students had kind of evaluation apprehension when in front of camera, and I experienced that for myself as well, to a great extent, to be honest with you. But in terms of this evaluation apprehension, or the idea that why this is different from the time that we are not in front of camera. So what is the difference, and what's the individual differences in terms of those apprehensions? And this is something that cognitive approach could explain. I mean, it's hard to have that explained by other approaches. And so cognitive approach takes a mechanistic view of human beings, and they take a reductionist view, meaning that human cognition could be considered like a machine, reductions or consist of different elements. The combination of all those elements together brings about the functionality. So for OCD, for example, there are basic cognitive appraisals for every emotions. For example, there are basic cognitive appraisals. The combination of these approaches is the total cognition, total emotion, because emotion is also as kind of a cognition in terms of cognitive psychology.
Also in 1973, Edward Hoffman, Michael M. Terpogosian, and Michael E. Phelps at Washington University built the first positron emission tomography scanner, or PET camera, for human studies. Then in 1974, it was first successfully tested. The first whole-body PET scanner appeared in 1977, and today there are over 2,500 PET scanners being used in the U.S.
Probably my favorite is a little bit different, because I was split. So I think my favorite would have been the MRI, the creation of the MRI, the Institute for Studying and Research on Mental Health and family therapy. A lot of theorists got together just looking at how to research therapy, doing therapy specifically with couples and families, even with children, but it was just a lot of some of the top therapists and top researchers getting together and discussing their ideas and coming up with quick ways to do therapy, quick and effective ways to do therapy. So out of that they came up with a lot of different directions and a lot of different models. So I just think it would have been really fun.
Hi, my name is Kendra Anderson, and I will be discussing the years 1975 through 1980. And during this time period, not only did our country continue to grow in terms of women's and gay rights, but the Vietnam War had also just ended. And what else is this time period known for? Serial killers. To begin, the Vietnam War began in 1955, lasting about 20 years before it ended in 1975. Among the 3 million troops who returned home from the war, almost 19% of them suffered from a lifetime of PTSD. At this time, PTSD was not yet listed as a psychological disorder in the DSM-2. However, with the research that stemmed from Vietnam veterans and with the influence of social movements from veterans and other advocacy groups, the APA would add PTSD to the DSM-3 as an anxiety disorder when it was published in 1980. This led to more treatments of PTSD as the prevalence of PTSD began to grow in this time during the Vietnam War. Next, in 1976, Richard Dawkins published The Selfish Gene. His book explains the process of evolution in biology using our genes as a basic unit. The theory or argument that Dawkins makes is that the natural selection process in evolution is not about making a species group secure. It is only about making an individual secure, and the body is just a carrier of its genes.
Millions of different species are here today because they were good at what they did in the past. They've come through a literally unbroken line of successful ancestors, where unsuccessful non-ancestors have been littered by the wayside. And so the genes in a swallow or in a kangaroo or in a hedgehog or in a human are all very, very good at making swallows or hedgehogs or kangaroos or humans. They had to be good at it, or they wouldn't have come through the generations today. Now that, I think, is an inspiring vision, and that's what fired me up about the very idea of the selfish gene.
Also, in 1976, Michael Gazzaniga and George Armitage Miller coined the term cognitive neuroscience in their efforts to understand how the brain represents mental events. The goal of their research in cognitive neuroscience was to explore the biological foundations of human cognition.
We would simply say to the patient, well, why did you do that? The patient would make up a story that would explain why their hand had done one thing and why the other hand had done another thing, and wove a tale that made coherent, as it were, the behaviors that are coming from all these separate brain areas. The behavior comes out, and then there's this little narrator up there that turns it into a story that makes us feel coherent and unified. Turns out it's a thing in the left hemisphere that does this, and we called it the interpreter, and it's a very powerful force in the human condition, and it's always trying to figure out and seek explanations for our behavior. And that's what it does. I think the human as a storytelling animal, as some people put it, is because this system is continually trying to keep the story coherent, and even though these actions may be coming from processors going on outside of, initially, of conscious awareness, an action is produced, and then you want to explain that action as to be part of your coherence and your story, your narrative. Why does the human always seem to like fiction? What is that? Could it be, as some people have suggested, could it be that prepares us for unexpected things that happen in our life because we've already thought about them in our fantasy world.
Cognitive psychology views emphasize on thought process, cognition's understanding, and it has some outgrowths in recent years or recent decades, such as mindfulness and metacognition and epistemological metacognition. So it's growing and it's got dominant after humanistic psychology. It could be considered as dominant still today. It's a major, very, very potent approach in psychology and has potential applications in therapy such as that in CBT or mindfulness-based therapy and other approaches that could help humans in a way that other approaches cannot. For example, in terms of me filming in this project, in class projects, I've noticed other students had kind of evaluation apprehension when in front of camera, and I experienced that for myself as well to a great extent, to be honest with you. But in terms of this evaluation apprehension or the idea that why this is different from the time that we are not in front of camera. So what is the difference and what's the individual differences in terms of those apprehensions? And this is something that cognitive approach could explain. I mean, it's hard to have that explained by other approaches. And so cognitive approach takes a mechanistic view of human beings and they take a reductionist view, meaning that human cognition could be considered like a machine, reductions or consist of different elements. The combination of all those elements together brings about the functionality. So for OCD, for example, there are basic cognitive appraisals for every emotions. For example, there are basic cognitive appraisals. The combination of these approaches is the total cognition, total emotion, because emotion is also as kind of a cognition in terms of cognitive psychology.
In the year 1978, not only do we see Mary Ainsworth publish about her strange situation experiment, but we also hear the term cognitive neuroscience for the first time. Mary Ainsworth published her book, Patterns of Attachment, about her work on attachment theory and the strange situation experiment. Ainsworth's research expanded on research done by John Bowlby. Her theory on attachment says that there are 4 distinct kinds of parent and child attachment: secure attachment, insecure avoidant attachment, insecure ambivalent attachment, and disorganized attachment.
The first style of attachment is called secure attachment. And so secure attachment children are definitely distressed when the mother leaves the room. And when the stranger comes in, they're definitely avoidant of the stranger, or they avoid the stranger unless the mother's in the room. And then if the mother's in the room, they're friendly. They're generally happy when the mother comes back into the room. And when they're in the room with the mother, they generally feel free to explore the room, but they always glance back to see where the mother is. They're definitely attentive where the mother is in the room. About 70% of children are securely attached. The next attachment pattern is called resistant or anxious ambivalent. These children experience intense distress when the mother leaves the room, even more so than secure attached. And the infant is generally afraid of the stranger. And when the mother returns in the room, the child is generally upset at the mother for leaving her or him. Avoidant attachment pattern usually occurs in 15% of children. And avoidant attachment is the child doesn't really get separation anxiety when the mother leaves and is okay with the stranger, plays normally with the stranger, and shows little interest in the mother when she returns in the room. Children with avoidant attachment patterns may be more likely to engage in antisocial behavior and also have difficulty forming close relationships with others. So disorganized attachment is commonly seen when there's some sort of child abuse going on. And so what happens is the child is actually relieved when the mother leaves because the mother may be abusive, and is warm and happy to see the stranger, and even happier to see the stranger than the mother.
Late 1970s are when we begin to see some of the most notorious serial killers in America, such as Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Son of Sam, and John Wayne Gacy. Robert Kenneth Ressler was an FBI agent and author. He played a significant role in the psychological profiling of violent offenders in the 1970s and is often credited with coining the term serial killer. Between 1976 and 1979, Ressler helped organize the interviews of 36 incarcerated serial killers in attempts to find parallels between a criminal's backgrounds and motives. The horrific actions of these people sparked a lot of questions in the field of psychology. Why do they do it? Are killers born, or are they made?
From Hannibal Lecter to Dexter.
Want to know a secret? Daddy kills people.
Our strange fascination with serial killers can be traced in part to the mystery behind the horror.
In reality, we know that there's some common denominators that most of them have.
The term serial killer is actually pretty new. The first known published reference found in a New York Times article from 1981 that described a serial or pattern murderer. That was referring to Wayne Williams, suspected in the deaths of more than 30 children. The FBI defines serial killers as anyone who murders 2 or more people in separate incidents.
It means that they think about what they've done and they go out and do it again.
And serial killers typically have a few other traits in common.
He didn't look like anybody's notion of somebody who would tear apart young girls.
American serial killer Ted Bundy, the subject of a new Netflix series, murdered at least 30 women in the 1970s. Bundy fits the serial killer profile in several ways. For starters, he's a he. 5 out of 6 serial killers are men. And he was a young man in his mid-20s when he committed his first murder.
Serial killers, some of them develop their fantasies as early as 5 years old. And the average age that a serial killer first kills is 28.
Majority of serial killers have another important element in common. They almost always fit the technical definition of a psychopath.
A psychopath, or someone who has psychopathic tendencies, basically is someone who is very grandiose, someone who lacks sympathy and empathy, puts their own needs, whether they're financial or sexual, ahead of the well-being or even the lives of other people.
Neuroscientist Kent Kiehl was among the first to identify psychopaths by imaging their brains. Most psychopaths are criminals, so back when he was a student at the University of British Columbia, Kiehl conducted MRI scans on the prison population in Abbotsford, BC.
We've been able now to, in sample sizes 100 times bigger, to show exactly what we think is wrong or different about the psychopathic brain.
I'm sorry, I didn't see you there. Busy solving the issues of narcissism and why sociopaths exist today. You know, just a little thing that I gotta take care of. My name is Larson Rogers, and I'm going to be discussing the late 1900s. The 1980s and the 1990s weren't exactly filled with too many brand new psychological terms or theories, but rather was the experimental era of theories such as CBT and humanistic psychology. Psychologists were beginning to branch away from the modern era where psychotherapy solely focused on behavior or psychoanalysis.
And wanting to have sex with your mother. Most unusual.
Which was presented by famous figures such as Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, B.F. Skinner, and Jean Piaget. This transitional phase caused a lot of questioning, doubt, criticism, and skepticism, and even some hatred. The pre-modern and modern eras had been practiced for so many years that many felt postmodern theories wouldn't be successful. The deaths of humanistic psychologists fueled these doubts even more. Carl Rogers, alongside Abraham Maslow, was one of the first humanistic psychologists who focused on the good of a client rather than just the presenting problems, died in 1987 at the age of 85.
Examine and reevaluate that very special way of being with another person, which we call empathic. I believe we tend to give too little importance and consideration to an element which is extremely important in the understanding of personality dynamics and for affecting changes in personality and in behavior. I think it's one of the most delicate and potent tools that we have, and I'm impressed at how rarely we see it in real-life situations in any
full-fledged form.
In 1994, Roy O'May passed away.
Now, I think anxiety is associated with creativity. When you're in a situation of anxiety, you can, of course, run away from it, and that's certainly not constructive. Or you can take a few pills to get you over it, or cocaine, or whatever else you may take.
You could meditate.
Well, you could meditate, but I think none of those things, including meditation, which I happen to believe in, but none of those paths lead you to creative activity. What anxiety means is it's as though the world is knocking at your door, and you need to create, you need to make something, you need to do something. And I think anxiety thus is for people who have found their own heart and their own souls. For them it is a stimulus toward creativity, toward courage. It's what makes us human beings.
And 3 years later, Viktor Frankl, known for his book Man's Search for Meaning, also passed away.
Is, we may say, a meaning-centered psychotherapy, inasmuch particularly as logotherapy sees a human being not predominantly determined, not to say dominated, by the will to pleasure, as you were mentioning, nor by the will to power along the lines of Adlerian teachings, but basically, fundamentally, by a will to meaning. That is to say, the desire, the impulse to find, to discover in life, or better to say in each life situation, concrete life situation confronting someone, the desire to find a meaning therein and to go on to fulfill it.
Joseph F. Rycroft, described as one of the last grand theorists, proposed for both a rigorous and humanistic psychology. In 1988, he published The Psychology of Rigorous Humanism. Not only was the humanistic psychology developed in this era, but also the psychopharmacology type. You know, pill popping. In the year 1980, the DSM-3 was published. The main difference between the DSM-3 and the DSM-2 was the transition from a multi-category system to a multi-axial format, which gave a more complete and reliable diagnosis of complex clinical cases. Antidepressants began to develop as well. In the year 1974, fluoxetine was discovered, which led to the first official FDA-approved SSRI antidepressant drug in 1987. A year later, Prozac was launched. After Prozac was released, other SSRIs were developed as well, such as sertraline in 1991, paroxetine in 1992, and citalopram in 1998. The psychopharmacology world erupted, and thus giving a new resource for psychologists and psychiatrists to use for their clients suffering with anxiety and depression. Dialectical behavior therapy was founded by Marsha Linehan.
The good news is they're probably good for everybody. The only reason I know that is everybody I know uses them that's ever learned them. I use them all the time. Just about everybody can use skills to be more skillful. I mean, the only people who don't need DBT skills probably are people who are very regulated.
Stephen C. Hayes, a psychology professor at the University of Nevada, began with how language and thought influenced our internal experiences.
When you stand with yourself in a self-compassionate, kind, loving way, life opens up. And then you can turn towards meaning and purpose and how you bring love, participation, beauty, contribution into the lives of others.
In summary, my friends, the late 1900s weren't really filled with too many new ideas or approaches in the psychology world. However, the latter years of the 20th century were filled with different ideas and different approaches on how to follow the humanistic and psychology approach and to accomplish and target smaller issues that we are still continuing to face today.
Hi, my name is Jasmine, and I will be reviewing the most recent developments of psychology, starting with
Max Bellman's publishing Understanding Consciousness in the year 2000. The purpose of the book was to argue in favor of reflexive monism. Bellman's dives into the aspect of consciousness that involves the experience of observing external objects. In 2001, David Phillips discovered what is known as the Baskerville effect. This theory is named after the Sherlock Holmes novel The Hounds of Baskerville, in which the main character suddenly dies from seeing a feral dog. Phillips and his colleagues conducted a study on Chinese and Japanese Americans that had died from heart attacks. They found that the most common day of passing was the 4th of every month, which is considered an unlucky day according to Chinese and Japanese culture. They concluded that it is possible to die simply from fear itself due to an overactive nervous system, or in this case, from superstition.
In 2002, George W. Bush advocated for legislation that guaranteed comprehensive mental health coverage, and New Mexico became the first state to pass legislation that allowed psychologists to prescribe psychiatric medication.
We must trust patients and doctors to make medical decisions and empower them with better information and better options.
Psychologist Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for his contributions to economic theory by applying psychological information on decision-making and uncertainty. Steven Pinker released his book The Blank Slate, which argues against the popular theory that everyone is born as a blank slate and are influenced only by their upbringing. Pinker instead theorized that we are all born with innate traits and that biology is an important factor. Jumping ahead to 2010, Simon LeVay published his book, Gay, Straight, and the Reason Why, which suggests that sexual orientation comes from a combination of sex hormones, genes, and the prenatal development of cells. As the legalization of cannabis in the United States expands, psychologists begin to focus more on its chronic cognitive effects.
I'm Andrew Huberman, and I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. Today we are discussing cannabis. What I can assure you is that by the end of today's podcast, you will have a quite thorough understanding of cannabis, how it works, what it does, what its potential benefits can be, what its potential hazards are, and whether or not it's right for you and the people that you know.
The term attention economy was coined due to the increasing consumption of digital content. Attention economy suggests that human attention is a scarce resource that social networks attempt to gain through attention-grabbing algorithms.
Every time you open your phone or computer, you're walking onto a battleground for the most valuable resource of the 21st century, your attention. The term attention economy was coined by Nobel laureate Herbert Simon, who in 1971 wrote that a wealth of information would create a poverty of attention. Fundamental to the attention economy is the recognition of human attention as a scarce resource.
2012 was a groundbreaking year for the transgender community. The American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry recommended the prescription of puberty-suppressing drugs to transgender children and hormone therapy starting at the age of 16. The American Psychiatric Association released official statements backing the civil rights and care of transgender individuals. The DSM-5 was released in 2013. Gender identity disorder was replaced with gender dysphoria. Binge eating disorder, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, and hoarding disorder were all also added. In 2015, the journal Psychology Today deleted any physician that listed gay conversion therapy in their profiles and no longer allowed advertisements for it.
And yes, we're going to turn you all straight because you're all gay kids, and that's a problem. Okay? You guys pumped up? Yeah. Well, I know I am, because as we say at New Beginnings, hetero is better, yo.
In 2019, the World Health Organization had its 11th revision of the International Classification of Diseases, which added gaming disorder. As smartphone gaming continues to gain popularity and the gaming industry is rapidly growing, social media utilizes psychology to make it intentionally addictive, enforcing limbic capitalism, which is the encouragement of overconsumption and addiction. When the COVID-19 pandemic struck in 2020, it took a worldwide toll on mental health, increasing cases of anxiety and depression.
Overall, the 2000s covered the development of interesting new theories, classified new mental health disorders, exposed media manipulation, and progressed equality for the LGBTQ+ community.
It has been acknowledged that the wounds of the mind have longer lasting effects than the wounds of the body, and the history of psychology is littered with both. However, psychology is one of the few realms of history that show that humanity is capable of learning from its mistakes. It took many centuries from the ancient Greek philosophers to the Renaissance to the modern day, but through psychology's effort, the scientific community now has both a great understanding of the human mind and a greater empathy for humanity itself. Humanity has always been fascinated with its place within the universe, and psychology is furthering our understanding of the inner universe within us all. Where does psychology take us next? That's up to you. Thanks for watching this video, and remember, keep on learning about the mind.
This little student's amateur video we're going.
Yeah, I don't know how to have my hands. Not like that.
Oh, frick. Sorry, start over.
Hi, I'm Emma. Can we restart?
And I, Dr. Rogers.
Again? From the beginning?
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Just start again. Michael, wash. I can't remember. Hi, I'm Emma. Sorry. And we're gonna discuss. Can we not read them? And we're have to read. Can you hold that?
Hello.
Hi, my name is Abby Vandenberg, and I will be oh my gosh.
Oh gosh, dang it. Okay, psychologist to person.
100, and we're gonna start with William James.
It's not gonna work. I can't. I said the 1900s. She didn't say it.
Shh! I'm filming. It's been a while since I've been on camera. I'm not nervous. Just want to get this right.
It's Bobo Doll.
Bobo Doll.
Oh my gosh.
You need to be like, are you ready to see the most horrifying footage of your life? Are you prepared for this? Here, I'll start it.
In the 1800s, James Lange theory.
Emma.
I can't. You're gonna need a new partner.
Start over. Go.
Cognitive psychology.
I want to do that again.
Nervous. You get it.
Do it good.
Think of it as a drill. Is it you want to go
Should I do my
Yes. Why
do a practice run. Perfect. I'm telling you, there's a way to put it.
Hi, my name is Abby Vandenberg, and I will be. That's it, I think.
Okay, do it one more time.
Charles George Lange. Cool. Okay.
One more time.
Oh, you did that?
Yep, let's do one more run.
Hi, I'm Abby Vandenberg, and I will be presenting. Really probably should be smiling as we say these horrible things.
No. Yes. That's why you're saying it on camera.
A big time for lots of other things.
Couldn't you use those?
No! Tell me what cognitive psychology is in 30 seconds or less.
Cognitive psychology.
Okay, you can start over.
But what was going on in the community? Sorry. Do you want to say that last part?
Sure. Side put it back. Marked. Okay.
Listen. You got issues.